this video we will create the landscape for our Star Wars Legion Endor project. We start right away with creating the lightweight frame structure for a terrain feature. In this case it's quite small. If you're creating a full Star Wars Legion table, keep in mind the size is 3 by 6 foot, and thus you will need 2 extra supports divided over the length of the frame and pre-drill the holes where the screws will go. For some extra sturdiness you may want to use 2 screws on each side, but for this small piece 1 will suffice. Repeat this process for all of the corners. In your measurements, don't forget the thickness of the plywood. Once done, we will cut a piece of foam to size with a utility knife. These foam pieces are usually bought at hardware stores and is used for insulation of roofing and whatnot. It's easy to cut through with a hobby knife. In this video we actually used some leftover parts, which are actually too thick, and you may want to use a thinner piece. After cutting the foam to size, we will try and fit it into our rectangular frame. It might prove to be a tight fit, but this shouldn't be an issue. Just use some force to fix it in place. Any extreme excess can now be cut to make it fit perfectly. Just push it all the way down. Next, mark where the actual terrain will be, such as hills and rocks. Remember, this can all be done modular as well, but a fixed form is usually better looking. We will be creating a small cliff with a waterfall and a creek going down in the middle. Once more, we mark the total size for the terrain so we can use the height difference for the creek. A block of foam is added in the corner to provide as a base for the rocky cliff. Keep marking your plan out so you'll know what each shape will provide. After marking our river, we will use a utility knife to create the bedding of the creek. This is the easiest way to cut if you don't have a hot wire tool. Do watch your fingers and try to cut away from the body. After some repetitive work, it should look something like this. Next we will fit the foam block into place. You can cut a little bit of foam at the bottom away where the block meets the creek. Mark the waterfall and the creek and chip away parts of the foam block as shown to create some natural shaping for the steps further on. Don't forget to cut the creek and waterfall as well. With all the chipping, it's important to not be too precise, as it will diminish the rough natural shapes. We chose to add another block of foam to the other side as well. Note that if these two don't fit each other perfectly, you can solve this later with some plaster. Now you know all the base shapes, you can glue everything together. You may also want to add some small pieces of foam to create hills or rock outcroppings on the scene. Use PVA glue, kit or foam glue to fix everything into place. Both have great results, although with larger hills and pieces, I do suggest foam glue, as PVA tends to warp the foam if it's larger. For the river bedding, we chose to use a transparent kit to water seal the whole creek. Since we will be using 2-part clear epoxy resin, we will need to seal off both ends by using some random temporary scrap blocks. Stick these blocks to the ends and hold them into place with some skewers. These can later be removed once everything is hardened out. I applied the kit with my fingers. I think this is the best way to make sure you get into all of the corners. Also add the kit to the block to prevent from any leakage in future steps. Do this at both ends. Next we will add talus stones to the river bedding. These are from Woodland Scenics, but any sort of stone will do. Add the big stones first and then add the smaller ones later. Lastly, we used aquarium sand for the areas where the creek goes over into the soil. Once everything's dry, you can vacuum any excess sand and stones with a handheld vacuum or a regular one on low suction power. Next we will decide where to place some trees. We drilled a hole in the bottom of the trees to add some magnets to them for easier access later on, since we don't want to make the terrain modular. Glue the magnets into place using montage kit or PVA glue. The ones we used are 5 mm in diameter. Drill a hole in the foam and be sure to add all the magnets in the same direction for the right polarity. We will now start by adding the plaster to the scene to create some great looking rocks. Add the plaster to a bowl in a 3:1 ratio with 3 parts plaster and 1 part water. This may vary on the plaster you are using. I usually don't mix it too precise. When it's too thin or too thick, I'll add water or more plaster until it's the right consistency. It's important to note that this process is to be handled within a small time frame as it hardens quite fast. About 20 minutes is the working time, then it's usually solid enough to the point that it's not easy to work with anymore. At the beginning, it's quite thin, so first off you will want to spread it everywhere you need to be. Work in small sections, especially if you're new to the use of it. Keep pushing it around while it's slowly drying until it's solid enough to form it into a shape. You may want some rock references when creating these shapes. Most importantly, you will want to shape it randomly with a lot of different shapes and depths. We used a painting knife to sculpt the clay as it's drying in the right shape. Once it's hardening, it's easier to form in the right shapes. As shown in the video, you can add some cracks and crevices. We used our cat for scale reference. After the base sculpting, it should look something like this. Once it's in the stage that it's really dry, you can use a utility knife and the steel wire brush to create some extra rough looking edges. We can add the pine trees to the scene to see where we want our other trees bought at a terrain modeling store to be. These trees can look a bit simple and have a plastic feel to the stem, so we chose to add some primer to them using leather brown spray from the army painter. Next, we will want to add some extra foliage to both the trees. For the lighter tree, we start off with some coarse turf burnt grass. Then we will add burnt grass in fine turf. Spray some glue spray on the tree and sprinkle the coarse turf on the top until you have a good coverage. Repeat this and add the fine turf for a more realistic finish. Lastly, we decided to add some fine turf earth to create some more color difference. For the darker colored trees, we used coarse turf medium green and fine turf soil and green grass. Repeat the previous steps with the glue spray. First add coarse turf, once more spray the tree with the glue spray, followed by some fine turf soil, another coat of spray, followed by some fine turf green grass. Fix the trees into place using a hot glue gun. We chose not to magnetize these, as their bases will be pulled into the terrain later on. Mark the magnet locations before we can continue to the next step. We mixed some sand with our plaster mixture and added some stones as well. This will all help to create a good surface for the ground of the terrain. We are going to smear the mixture out onto the battlefield. But do not do this in a flat manner. Add some structure to it by tapping here and there on the surface and by adding several layers. Next we will want to create foliage. Here we have HO ferns, which we need to cut out first by using our fingernails. Be sure to cut them at the stem. Next we will add some PVA glue in a blob in a corner. You will want to try and bend several leaves together for a quick approach. Then stick the end of the leaf in some glue. Take another leaf and stick them together. Here's where the baking paper comes into place, since you can put them down and glue them together for a fast approach this way. Another option is to use aquarium plants. Here we used one where we cut off the ends. After we have enough of them, we chose to prime them with Army Painter Angel's Green. First paint the stems brown using Citadel Dryad bark. Do this all the way up to the leaves. Then, using a dry brushing technique, we add Death World Forest to the leaves. This can get messy, being that the plastic plants are not resilient, so you have to support it with your fingers a lot. may want to add another layer using the same technique by using the color striking green. Once done creating our foliage, we primed our terrain with leather brown. This is a quick, effective method. However, you may opt to paint it with some cheaper brown acrylic paints from a dollar store. Make sure all the foam is covered, since the spray tends to be aggressive and eat away in the foam if not treated. To paint the bedding of the creek and the rocks, we used Scave and Blight Tinge. You might want to add another coat after the first coat has been applied for a good base coverage. Next, we will be flocking the ground, using some PVA glue and then some fine turf green grass. Note that we added a sheet of paper in the creek to prevent any flock from coming in there. After the ground is fully covered with thinned down PVA glue, add some flocking using a shaker. Next, add some fine turf earth in a smaller amount on specific places for some variation. Fine turf soil will be added mostly around the base of the trees and the edges of the rocks, towards the creek. Now it's time to start adding the foliage. Take a small drill bit and create holes to put the stems into place using PVA glue. We also added ferns using a pair of tweezers. Once these are dried, you can easily wipe them off the sheet of baking paper. For some extra realistic effects, you can add some ground up leaves. We blended together and sifted to be used as small fallen leaves. Add these around the base of the trees and around some plants. To seal these into place, I made a mixture of PVA glue and water, up to the point where it's very liquid in the substance. You may want to use a pipette to add the glue exactly onto the fallen leaves. To get a better flow, you can use flow improver to the mixture used for paints. Don't be afraid of the white color, since it will dry up clear. We used some twigs found in the woods or bought at Woodland Scenics to add even more realism to the bedding of the creek and the ground. Finally, you can create small bushes using different kinds of coarse turf, adding the PVA glue water mixture to the flock and then sprinkling on some fine turf. Now, to finish the rocks and the bedding of the creek, we use a mixture of Scave and Blight Tinge and Vallejo Model Color Silver Grey. After wiping the brush clean, we use the same dry brush technique as explained before. Repeat this step with Vallejo Model Color Stone Grey. finish it off with some pure silver grey from Vallejo Model Color, only touching the upper surfaces. We are now ready for the final step of adding water to the piece. We used a 2-part epoxy resin that clears dry. The label tells you the exact consistency of each of the parts. In our case, a ratio of 100:60. You can measure the volume needed for the mixture, but you can never truly know how much you'll need. I'd rather make too much than too little. Add the mixture together and be sure to steer well, but not too fast to prevent air from entering the mix. We added Dragonhof Nightshade for some pigment in the water. Be sure not to add too much because you want the water to stay clear. Pour the resin slowly and steady and divide it over the length of the creek. We forgot to add some sticks before, so we do it afterwards, although it's better to place them beforehand. Use a skewer to break and divide the surface tension at the corners and to remove air bubbles, and repeat this process sporadically for the next 2 hours. For some final touches, we're gonna glue some ivy to the rocks and trees. The ivy we used is from Mini Nature. The project is now finished and should look something like this. Hey there, thanks for watching this video. We hope you liked it and be sure to subscribe if you did. Hit the notification bell to get updated and feel free to drop a comment below.